You hear the term emerging markets thrown around all the time, right? In the news and finance, but what does it actually mean? Where did this idea even come from? And more importantly, why is it completely reshaping our world? Well, let's get into it. You've definitely seen these acronyms flash across your screen. BRICS, Mint, Civets, the next 11. It feels like a total alphabet soup of global economics, doesn't it? They're all connected to emerging markets for sure. But what are they actually trying to tell us? Let's break it all down. Okay, so at its core, the definition is pretty straightforward. Think of an emerging market as an economy that's really on the move. It's not yet considered developed like, say, the US or Germany, but it's also moved way past the early developing stage. It's in this really dynamic transitional phase. You're seeing rapid growth and much, much deeper connections to the global economy. But where did this term even come from? This is fascinating. It wasn't just some dry economic classification cooked up in a lab. It was actually a brilliant piece of marketing that completely reframed how the world saw these economies. I mean, this slide says it all, doesn't it? Before the 1980s, these places were often called less developed countries. Just think about that phrasing. It sounds stagnant, risky, not exactly a place you'd want to invest your money. But emerging? Now that sounds dynamic, hopeful, full of potential. It's all about forward motion. And here's exactly when that shift happened. So picture it, it's 1981 and a World Bank economist named Antoine van Actmel is trying to launch a new investment fund for these countries. But he had a problem, the name. Nobody wanted to invest in less developed countries. So he came up with emerging market, and wow, did it stick. It literally transformed the perception from one of risk to one of incredible opportunity. But it's not all just about spreadsheets and growth curves. This quote from political scientist Ian Bremmer adds a really crucial layer of reality. In an emerging market, politics can be just as important, sometimes more important, than the pure economics. And that's key because it perfectly captures that unique mix of high potential and, high risk that really defines these places. All right, so we've got the definition down. But who's actually in the club? Who gets a seat at the table? Well, this is where things get a little messy. It turns out there's no single bouncer at the door deciding who gets in and who doesn't. So, which countries are on the list? The truth is, it depends on who you ask. Different organizations, from the IMF to big index providers like MSCI and FTSE, they all have their own criteria and their own lists. So let's look at a few of the most famous groupings you've probably heard about. First up, the big one, the one everybody knows, BRICS. This term was coined way back in the early 2000s by an economist at Goldman Sachs. It stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The whole idea was that these 5 huge economies, with their massive populations and resources, were basically on track to become the new drivers of global growth. But then, of course, other acronyms started popping up, like MINT. That's Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. These countries were identified as the potential next wave of economic giants, sharing a lot of the same characteristics as the BRICS, huge populations and a ton of growth potential. And the list just keeps on going. Take Civets, Colombia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Egypt, Turkey, and South Africa. Now, by this point, you're probably noticing some overlap, right? Names like Indonesia, Turkey, and South Africa keep appearing. And this is where it starts to feel less like a clear set of lists and more like a complicated web of classifications. Okay, this table really helps cut through all that noise. So while all those acronyms are kind of confusing, just look at the last 2 columns. Those are the official lists from the big guys, the major index providers, FTSE and MSCI. And suddenly, a clear consensus starts to emerge. Countries like Brazil, India, Mexico, Turkey, and Indonesia get a check mark almost every time. So the big takeaway here is this. The labels might change, but the core group of players, they're largely agreed upon. Okay, so we've defined the term, we've identified the key players. But why does any of this really matter? Why is this so important? Well, it's because we are living through one of the most significant economic power shifts in modern history, period. This chart tells the whole story. Seriously, look at this. Back in 1960, the countries we now call emerging markets made up just over a quarter of the world's economic output. Now, fast forward to 2013, and that number has just skyrocketed. This isn't just some small trend, it's a fundamental rebalancing of the entire global economic order. Just think about that number for a second. 53%.
By 2013, the countries that were once dismissed as less developed were now producing more than half of the world's economic output when you adjust for purchasing power. This is a massive, massive shift in the world's economic center of gravity.
And these are the titans leading that charge. We're talking about China, India, Brazil, Russia, and Mexico, the largest emerging economies by pure GDP. These aren't just big markets anymore. We're talking about some of the largest economies on the planet. Their scale is absolutely immense, and their growth continues to shape, well, everything, from global trade to geopolitics. So all of this leads us to our final, and maybe the most interesting question. If these markets are getting so powerful and sophisticated, at what point are they no longer emerging? What does the future actually hold for the term itself? You can kind of think of economic development as a journey with a few stages. A country can graduate from one status to the next, and that emerging phase is just one stop along the way. In fact, some analysts now use this middle category called emerged for countries that have already made that leap to a higher income level. And this isn't just a theory, by the way. We have very clear examples of this graduation happening. Countries like South Korea, Poland, and Singapore, they were once classic emerging markets. But today, thanks to incredible growth and stability, they're now classified as fully developed or emerged economies. They've made it. You know, this isn't a new conversation. Way back in 2008, The Economist magazine pointed out that the term was already starting to feel a bit outdated, especially for giants like China. And yet, here we are, all these years later, still using it. Mostly because a better, more nuanced replacement just hasn't really caught on. So that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. As the line between developed and emerging gets blurrier and blurrier, and as giants like China and India really take center stage, does the very category of emerging market even make sense anymore? Or are we going to need a whole new language to describe our truly multipolar global economy?